Henry Philippe Benoni Omer Joseph Pétain, generally known as Philippe Pétain, Marshal Pétain or the Lion of Verdun, was a French general who reached the distinction of Marshal of France, and was later Chief of State of Vichy France, from 1940 to 1944. Pétain, who was 84 years old in 1940, ranks as France's oldest head of state. Because of his outstanding military leadership in World War I, particularly during the Battle of Verdun, he was viewed as a national hero in France. During World War II, with the imminent fall of France in June 1940, Pétain was appointed Premier of France by President Lebrun at Bordeaux, and the cabinet resolved to make peace with Germany. The entire government subsequently moved briefly to Clermont-Ferrand, then to the spa town of Vichy in central France. His government voted to transform the discredited French Third Republic into the French state, an authoritarian regime. After the war, he was tried and convicted for treason. Early life. Pétain was born in Courtier-la-Tour in 1856. His father, Omer Venant, was a farmer. His great-uncle, a Catholic priest, Father Abbé Lefebvre, had served in Napoleon's Grande Armée Acute and told the young Pétain tales of war and adventure of his campaigns from the peninsulas of Italy to the Alps. In Switzerland, highly impressed by the tales told by his uncle, his destiny was from then on determined. Pétain joined the French army in 1876 and attended the Saint-Cyr Military Academy in 1887 and the École Supérieure de Guerre in Paris. Thereafter he alternated between staff and regimental assignments. Pétain's career progressed very slowly, as he rejected the French army philosophy of the furious infantry assault, arguing instead that firepower kills. His views were later proved to be correct during the First World War. He was promoted to captain in 1890 and major in 1900. Unlike many French officers, he served mainly in mainland France, never French Indochina or any of the African colonies, although he participated in the Rif campaign in Morocco. As colonel, he commanded the 33rd Infantry Regiment at Arras from 1911. The young Lieutenant Charles de Gaulle, who served under him, later wrote that his first colonel, Pétain, taught the art of command. In the spring of 1914 he was given command of a brigade. However, aged 58 and having been told he would never become a general, Pétain had bought a villa for retirement. Pétain was a bachelor until his 60s, and famous for his womanizing. Women were said to find his piercing blue eyes especially attractive. At the opening of the Battle of Verdun, he is said to have been fetched during the night from a Paris hotel by a staff officer who knew which mistress he could be found with. After the war, Pétain married an old lover, a particularly beautiful woman, Mme. Eugénie Harden, on 14 September 1920. Harden had been divorced from François de Rérain in 1914. Although the couple were too old to have children, she already had a son, Pierre de Rérain, from her first marriage. They were to remain married until the end of Pétain's life. World War I. Pétain led his brigade at the Battle of Guise. At the end of August 1914 he was quickly promoted to brigadier general and given command of the 6th Division in time for the First Battle of the Marne. Little over a month later, in October 1914, he was promoted again and became 33rd Corps commander. After leading his corps in the spring 1915 Artois offensive, in July 1915 he was given command of the Second Army, which he led in the Champagne offensive that autumn. He acquired a reputation as one of the more successful commanders on the Western Front. Verdun 1916. Pétain commanded the Second Army at the start of the Battle of Verdun in February 1916. During the battle he was promoted to commander of Army Group Centre, which contained a total of 52 divisions. Rather than holding down the same infantry divisions on the Verdun battlefield for months, akin to the German system, he rotated them out after only 2 weeks on the front lines. His decision to organize truck transport over the Voie Sacrée to bring a continuous stream of artillery ammunition and fresh troops into besieged Verdun also played a key role in grinding down the German onslaught to a final halt in July 1916. In effect, he applied the basic principle that was a mainstay of his teachings at the École de Guerre before World War I. Le feu, or firepower kills, in this case meaning French field artillery, which fired over 15 million shells on the Germans during the first 5 months of the battle. Although Pétain did say, on Les Auras, the other famous quotation often attributed to him, "Ils ne passeront pas," was actually uttered by Robert Nivelle, who succeeded him in command of the Second Army at Verdun in May 1916. At the very end of 1916, Nivelle was promoted over Pétain to replace Joseph Joffre as French commander-in-chief. Mutiny 1917. Because of his high prestige as a soldier's soldier, Pétain served briefly as Army Chief of Staff. He then became Commander-in-Chief of the French Army, replacing General Nivelle, whose Chemin des Dames offensive failed in April 1917, thereby provoking widespread mutinies in the French army. They involved, to various degrees, nearly half of the French infantry divisions stationed on the Western Front. Pétain restored morale by talking to the men, promising no more suicidal attacks, providing rest for exhausted units, home furloughs, and moderate discipline. He held 3,400 courts-martial. 554 mutineers were sentenced to death, but over 90% had their sentences commuted. The mood of the soldiers was to wait for the Americans to arrive and win the war. The mutinies were kept secret from the Germans, and their full extent and intensity were not revealed until decades later. Gilbert and Bernard find multiple causes. The immediate cause was the extreme optimism and subsequent disappointment at the Nivelle offensive in the spring of 1917. Other causes were pacifism, stimulated by the Russian Revolution and the trade union movement, and disappointment at the non-arrival of American troops. Pétain conducted some successful but limited offensives in the latter part of 1917. Unlike the British, who stalled in an unsuccessful offensive at Passchendaele that autumn, Pétain, instead, held off from major French offensives until the Americans arrived in force on the front lines, which did not happen until the early summer of 1918. He was also waiting for the new Renault FT tanks to be introduced in large numbers, hence his statement at the time, "I am waiting for the tanks and the Americans." 1918 saw major German offensives on the Western Front. The first of these, Operation Michael in March 1918, threatened to split the British and French forces apart, and, after Pétain had threatened to retreat on Paris, the Doullens Conference was called. Just prior to the main meeting, Prime Minister Clemenceau claimed he heard Pétain say, "Les Allemands battront les Anglais en race campagne. Après quoi ils nous battront aussi, in open country, then they'll beat us as well." He reported this conversation to President Poincaré, adding, "Surely a general should not speak or think like that." Haig recorded that Pétain had the terrible look. He had the appearance of a commander who had lost his nerve. Pétain believed, wrongly, that Gough's Fifth Army had been routed like the Italians at Caporetto. At the conference, Ferdinand Foch was appointed as Allied Generalissimo, initially with powers to coordinate and deploy Allied reserves where he saw fit. Pétain eventually came to the aid of the British and secured the front with 40 French divisions. Pétain proved a capable opponent of the Germans both in defense and through counter-attack. The Third Offensive Blücher, in May 1918, saw major German advances on the Aisne, as the French army commander ignored Pétain's instructions to defend in depth and instead allowed his men to be hit by the initial massive German bombardment. By the time of the last German offensives, Gneisenau and the Second Battle of the Marne, Pétain was able to defend in depth and launch counter-offensives, with the new French tanks and the assistance of the Americans. Later in the year, Pétain was stripped of his right of direct appeal to the French government and requested to report to Foch, who increasingly assumed the coordination and ultimately the command of the Allied offensives. After the war ended, Pétain was made Marshal of France on 21 November 1918.